Hello, everyone. It's Matt Lewis again, here to talk about storytelling, particularly the story of us and now, and how that relates to advocacy and some of the ideas that Brian has introduced us to, the notion of power with as opposed to power over. We're going to turn to a PowerPoint in a moment. Before we do, I want to underscore and lift up a few things that we heard from Brian. First is just that the hierarchical power dynamic of healthcare and kind of life writ large, right? It exists in society, the traditional notion of unilateral as opposed to being relational when it comes to power. We're wired, socialized to approach change making and advocacy as kind of putting forth the best idea, the best protocol, the best data point towards change. We aren't necessarily socialized to think that we have power with, and that power with largely exists as the motivation space of being on a team that's collaborative, that's connected, and is moving forward together. So how do we do that? Well, that heart activation happens with story. And we've already learned how to broadcast our own values with the story of self. And we've also tried on the tool of receiving others' values through one-to-one. So we know how to broadcast and we know how to engage with curiosity, to ask questions, to receive. So after we've broadcast and after we receive, there's two more story elements that we want to enter into the frame. The story of us, who are we, what are the challenge, choices, and outcomes of this team, this group, this pod, this cohort, this organization, and then what are we going to do together? What is the urgent collaborative action? And how do I tell the story of that urgent collaborative action? Basically, one way to think of it is, now that we're connected in the heart, how do I connect that to the hands? The good work we're going to do together. So let's turn to the PowerPoint to sort of itemize this and underscore some of the teaching points just a little bit more before we look at an example. When we shift our paradigm and our thinking from imagining that to accelerate change or change in general is not in fact coming from great individuals, dynamic individuals, but great communities and dynamic communities. Brian gave us the examples of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, LGBTQ movement, that if you look under the hood, it's in fact the community that is accelerating that change. To do that, we need to move from the story of what is my call to leadership, from the I to the we. What is our shared values, our shared experiences, and how do I animate that story? As the storyteller, how do I say that out loud so it stops just becoming what do I feel called to do, and it starts becoming what do we feel called to do? And in that, what do we feel called to do is a question of what is the urgent challenge that we can confront together, right? And so this visualization should help sort of give a little bit of framing when we think about it's not just my call to leadership, it's in fact our shared values, our shared challenges, and then how do we move from that place of now that we feel connected, now that we feel that really high excite energy on this team, where is it going to go? Where's that sort of urgent outlet towards doing something together, right? So let's zoom in a little bit and think about the story of us. When we think about the story of us, the first thing I want to say is that it's exactly what we were doing with the story of self. What is the challenge, choice, and outcome? And now that the actors are a collective we. So one of the prompts I often give in Story of Us workshops when we focus on that and practice that is asking this very simple question. What is this team about, and how do I know that is true, right? So what do we care about, and what are the times that I have seen evidence of that fact, which is another way to focus in on what are the challenges that have faced this group and the choices that this group has made that shows the values of this group, right? That same triplicate of challenge, choice, outcome. A few more things I want to say about the story of us is the story of us requires listening, right? So there has to be some one-on-one engagement where you've actually taken time to sort of hit pause and hear from others. It's a listening campaign before you can then go unpause and broadcast the story of what the shared values and shared experiences are on that team. So if we want to think of a little bit of the story of self requires vulnerability, being authentic and opening myself up. I think that the call to not necessarily vulnerability, but the call maybe in the story of us is one of a call to empathy, a call to listen, a call to key tune our ear to the challenges of those around us, what they have faced. And then to say, I've heard you and I want to tell the story of what we're about, right? So when we move from that story of self, my call to leadership, into that story of us, who are we? What are we about? It's really about I've listened to you, I've heard from you, and now I want to tell the story of who we are, right? So it's no longer just about me. It's no longer my call, what excites me, what motivates me, the choices I've made that animate the values that I have. Now it's the choices we've made that animate the values we have, right? And then we move into the story of now. And the story of now can both be sort of complex and super simple. So let me try this in the simple form, and then we'll dig a little deeper. So we're still thinking in terms of challenge, choice, and outcome, right? The challenge here is the urgency. Now, urgency is really the intersection of need and the intersection sometimes of opportunity. Sometimes it's both, but sometimes urgency is we have an opportunity right now that is very unique because of the people in this room to do something. And sometimes the urgency is we need to act now, right? There is something right there at our doorstep that requires our attention. So urgency has to always be in balance and held shoulder to shoulder with hope, right? A vision of the world if we succeed together. So sometimes we jump to the hope, right? If you see Dr. King on YouTube, everyone's going to go to the I have a dream. But we never really slow down and realize that that speech had a nightmare, right? There was a heaven and a hell that was animated in Dr. King's speech, right? I have this mountaintop that I think we're moving towards, but the reason we're moving there is there's an urgent challenge, right? So challenge and outcome, urgency and hope have to be held in the story of now kind of in equal weight. I've heard it said that if you give too much urgency, too much challenge, and then you say to people, here's the thing that we're going to do, and it doesn't feel hopeful, it's like the elephant giving birth to the fly. I joke that if we've ever heard Sarah McLachlan sing her song In the Arms of the Angel, right? As we look at the dogs and the shelters, if you know the infomercial that I'm talking about, there's this like massive desire to do something because the urgency is animated in that clip, but then the outcome never feels hopeful. We never get there. And that can become disempowering. So in the story of now, we have to hold in balance the urgency, the hope, the heaven and the hell. And in the middle of it, wedged right in the middle of it is a choice, right? Is a choice that you're calling people to make with you. Now, that choice is a little strategic. And I don't want you to start thinking, now I get to go back into my head and away from my heart. Now I get to stop being a storyteller and start becoming a person of strategy. That's actually not what we're aiming for. We're aiming to be very clear that this is a best first step we can make together and moves us towards a realization of the world that would reflect our shared values, right? So what is the best first step we can take to start creating an outcome, a hopeful outcome of the world as it ought to be, right? As the world that reflects our values. Now, Brian brought up that this can be capital A advocacy, right? Storming the monolith and going to rally at the Capitol building. But it doesn't always have to be that. It can be little a advocacy. The choices can be around increased awareness of frontline staff well-being in a workplace, right? Implementing racial justice training in the environment that I work in within healthcare. So this choice doesn't necessarily have to be slated at changing the world. It can be slated at changing our world, right? What is the world that the us lives in? Now that I've been able to say who the us is and how that connects to who I am, how do we take some steps together to make the world more as it ought to be, more as the world that reflects who we are and our value system? So I'm going to give us an example that brings it all together, that moves from that story of self into the story of us and the story of now, and actually doesn't do it kind of like step one, story of self, step two, story of us, step three, story of now. It does it much more fluidly. And it's a 5-minute clip of James Croft, who was a student in narrative, right? Took the narrative course. Narrative is a leadership act, narrative as a relational act, and worked on carving out a 5-minute story about bullying, particularly bullying as it relates to LGBTQ communities, very much part and parcel of his story of self. And then he took that story into the streets, right? He went into Harvard Square and he literally stood up with his bullhorn, and for 5 minutes he told a story. He told a story of why this is urgent, why it matters to him, and why it needs to matter to us. If our values are truly the values that we purport, then this issue matters to us, right? And what are we going to do about it? What is the best first step we can collectively take together? So as we go into this clip, I want you to listen to all those parts, and we're going to come back together to debrief it. But listen to when you hear a story of self, where and when do you hear a story of us, and when does it become a story of now? And realize that the whole way through, what James Croft is doing is telling a story. He never clips out of storytelling mode. He never moves into strategy. He never moves into data. He never moves into, this is a question of protocol, or this is something that we can fix if we come up with the right policy. What he's doing is he's being relational, and he's being relational through narrative. So let's move into that clip, and then we'll come back together for some final debriefing that will help us sort of see how he did it so we can better see how we can do it. Not just the story of self, but adding in the us and the now.
Wow, that works. It's amazing. 6.12 seconds. That's about how long it takes to fall 604 feet. And 604 feet is about how far Tyler Clementi fell after he jumped off the George Washington Bridge. Now, as we know, he took his own life because live video footage of him having a romantic encounter with another man was streamed live on the internet by his college roommate. Just one of a very long list of young people who have taken their lives because of anti-LGBT bullying in the past few weeks. Now, I never experienced anything like what Tyler went through when I was at school, but I was bullied for being gay. You see, when I was a kid, I was a ballet dancer. And every week I squeezed into a leotard and blue shiny hot pants. It was quite an outfit. And I spent an evening practicing demi-pieds and pirouettes. And I loved it. I loved the discipline. The music played on the old piano, the feel of the wood beneath my feet. I even secretly quite liked the outfit. But my schoolmates and some of my teachers didn't like ballet as much as I did. And one of my teachers, a PE teacher, used to make fun of me. He used to say how girly I was, how dancing is not something that a boy should do. I remember the sneer on his face as I walked past, and I remember that he was the first person to call me a fag, which at 7 years old, I didn't really understand. I remember in high school how gay was only ever used as a term of abuse. And I remember one cold morning sitting in assembly while the principal intoned, Homosexuals deserve our pity and our prayers. And I sat among hundreds of other boys thinking I was all alone in the world and that I was the only one who had this problem. Now, not everyone may have experienced something like that, but we all know, I think, what it means to feel alone, to feel like there's no one on our side. Perhaps you were too tall and the short kids made fun of you. Or perhaps you were too short and you got it from the taller ones. Or perhaps you were too smart or too dumb, or from the wrong side of town, or the wrong race. We all know, I think, even if just for a moment, what it feels like to think that there's no one on your side, to think that no one has your back. And all of us, if there are young people in our lives that we care about, can agree that we don't want this to happen to them. Imagine, if you can, what it must be like to come home and see a strange shape hanging from a tree in your backyard, twisting in the wind, the creak of the branch as it bends beneath the weight, and that feeling in your gut as you get closer and you realize what it is hanging there, who it is, who it was. Because that was Seth Walsh, 13, who hung himself from a tree in his backyard. It was Billy Lucas, who hung himself at his grandmother's house. And it was Raymond Chase, who hung himself in his dorm. And it could have been your brother, your sister, your son, your daughter, or your friend. It could have been one of us. So I know, I only came out in March this year, after 10 years after I first told my parents that I thought I was gay. And in those 10 years, I lost a lot of opportunities to make a difference. I was a high school teacher, and every day I wasn't out was a day I deprived a gay student of a positive role model. And I'm not willing to waste any more time. I have to act now. We have to act now. Because it isn't enough to let these things happen and then mourn them afterwards. We need to catch these kids before they jump. And there is something we can do to help as a start. Journalist Dan Savage has started a campaign, the It Gets Better campaign, to send messages of hope to teenagers who are being bullied because they're gay or for whatever reason, that they should have hope for their future, that they do have something to live for. And I think that if we made such a video, as Harvard students with glittering careers ahead of us and sparkling degrees, then we could make a difference. So we need people to hold a camera, to share their stories, to do editing and sound, to stand in a big group and say it gets better. No contribution is too small. And if you want to get involved and you're an undergraduate, talk to Tevin here. Do you mind waving?
Oh, hi.
And he'll tell you how to get involved. And if you're a graduate student, or if you just want to come along, from 5 to 7 p.m. in the Elliot Lyman Room in Longfellow Hall at the Education Schools campus, stand up and say, we're standing with these kids. We've got your back. Let's catch them before they jump. Thank you.
So we've just watched James Croft give his story, loosely titled 6.12 Seconds, that combines the broadcasting of a story of self, the calling and the coming together and the articulation of a story of us, and moving towards a story of now, a shared action. And before we move through bit by bit and piece by piece to look at how he did what he did, I just want everyone to take a moment and think about the images that stick in mind's eye. For me, it was that the love of the music when he was doing ballet, the feel beneath his feet of the old wood, the music on the old piano. I very much saw that auditorium as James Croft told us the story of the principal intoning those horrible words of disenfranchisement towards this young boy, right? I heard that. I was there with him in the auditorium. And I was certainly there in those moments of urgency with the creak of the branch, right? As someone is hanging in a tree, right? The 6.12 seconds and what that number looks like as someone falls, the urgency of having to catch someone before they fall. I very much saw that. So the whole way through, as he moved from story of self and us and now, we were always inside the story, right? And it's worth noting that where we began was with a story of now, right? Story of now was the urgency of the moment. And earlier we talked about urgency can either be about opportunity in terms of we can do something, or need. And so the urgency of need was made clear right from the start. And then he transitioned into a story of self where he said, I had never experienced the type of bullying that Tyler Clemente had, but I do know what it feels like growing up. And then he got us into those early images of his childhood. And he brought us back to a story of self when he talked about being a teacher. And he said, every day I was not out, I deprived a student of a positive role model, right? Again, challenge, choice, outcome. He was making a choice, and the outcome of that choice, well, he was making the negative choice of not coming out and being open with who he was. And the ramifications of that were very real, right? Were very urgent for a student. And it tied right back in to the urgency of the now that he begins us with at the start of the narrative, right? So we have an urgent now that sort of moves into a story of self. And then you might have noticed the bridge. When did the story of us come in? Well, it came in when he said, all of us know what it feels like to be alone, right? Maybe you're too tall or too short. And then he also brought back in the story of us where he said, this could be your brother, your sister, your son. It could have been one of us. This is no longer an issue just related to the speaker and his call to leadership. It's about all our shared values, all our shared experiences, right? He's giving us an opportunity to see ourselves into that story. So let's think about the story of now. We get the urgency of need right from the start, 6.12 seconds. It's how long it takes someone to fall. And we have to catch them before they fall. It's a refrain he comes back to, that urgency he comes back to throughout the narrative. But he also has some urgency of opportunity. Imagine these Harvard students with their gleaming degrees and their sparkling careers, right? Such beautiful language he's using in the story. Imagine what it will be like if we are the ones to make these videos. If we come together and someone sees this, if we stop depriving people of positive role models, if we come together and say, it gets better, well, then the world is going to become more hopeful, right? Our world is going to become more hopeful. So just as we saw in the story of now, where the urgency has to be in balance, like I said, shoulder to shoulder, we can't have the elephant giving birth to the fly, with hope. Right in the middle, he wedges a choice. And that choice is very clear, very actionable, and that choice is collective, right? So we're going to come together, and he actually points and says, if you're an undergrad, raise your hand and you can go here. We need someone to hold a camera, share their story, do sound editing. It's something we can all come together in, right? Now, this isn't going to completely transform the world, but it is going to catch them before they fall because it's a best first step, right? It's moving towards the world as it ought to be, as opposed to the world that it is. That Dr. King notion of heaven and hell, right? And I just want to point out one last thing. If he begins us in the urgency of the story of now and moves us into the story of self, then gives us a little bit of the story of us when he says we all know how it feels to be alone, then the urgency comes back in with really sharp, horrifying descriptions of what's happening right here and right now. And it could be any of us. Now we're back in the story of us, right? And then he moves us back into the story of self. When I was a teacher and every day that I wasn't out, I deprived students of a positive role model. So you can see that if we're looking at these three domains of storytelling, he's moving very fluidly through all of them. I mentioned earlier, it's not a didactic, first this, then the us, then the now, right? It's not self, us, now. It can be now, self, us, self, urgency, hope. So it's interesting to see how he traces it, and what you ultimately get is very much a sense of who he is, why he cares, why this is in line with his values, very much a sense of what we're going to do together, and then why it matters to all of us. And in doing that, he's making a collective call, a relational call for advocacy, that the advocacy is going to be born out of relationship. And he's activating that energy through storytelling so that all of our hearts are involved in this shared mission. So I hope you enjoy that as an illustrative example, as something you can look at and go, oh, it doesn't have to be capital A advocacy, and it can be done in a short 5 minutes. And I can actually move from here's who I am to here's who we are, and then here's what we are going to do together. And I would encourage you to try this. I would encourage you to think about this community, this team, right? This pod that I'm living in as a resident, this group that I'm a part of, this scholastic cohort, whatever it may be. What do they care about? What have I heard in my one-to-ones? What have I listened to in their experiences where I can then echo and articulate a story of us, connected into my story of self, all in service of this purposeful, urgent call to action. So that's what we're trying to do when we think about narrative, not just as the story of self, but as the story of self, us, and now.